Okay, this is the third subsection of our section on the death penalty, and we're going to start by talking about um, the research about the death penalty. So people like me, professors of criminal justice, have done research study after research study after research study about the death penalty, the benefits, the costs, all that stuff. And this is essentially what we found. So number one, one of the big one of the reasons that people claim they support the death penalty is because they don't want to pay to house a person for, life in prison. They say it's much cheaper to just kill them and be done with it, and they don't want taxpayer money going towards, feeding and housing this horrible person who did these horrible things. Now, the problem with that argument is that research study after research study has shown that it's not true. In fact, the death penalty costs far more than life in prison. Depending on the state and depending on exactly what years you're looking at, it's usually about 3 times as much. It costs 3 times as much to execute somebody than it does to keep them in prison for the rest of their life. And that's for a few different reasons. The actual execution part of it is not very expensive. But because of those Supreme Court cases we talked about earlier, we have to ensure that these accused people receive their due process. And that due process in a death penalty case is far, far, far more expensive than in a case without the death penalty. Now, we could cut down on those costs, but only at the expense of not giving these people their due process, which the Supreme Court has already ruled is a human right, a constitutional right, a right you have just because you're a person. If the government tries to take that away, that is a violation of those rights. The next thing we want to talk about is the 6 purposes of punishment. Okay? There are usually, depending on the intro to criminal justice textbooks you look at, they list 6 reasons for why we punish people. Okay? And if you want to give someone the death penalty, it should be linked to at least one, if not more than one of these reasons. So the first purpose of punishment is incapacitation, i.e., if we give them this punishment, they won't be committing crimes again for however long the punishment lasts. So if they're in prison for 10 years, they're incapacitated and not committing other crimes for 10 years. Now, the death penalty is the ultimate incapacitation. You kill somebody, you guarantee they're not going to commit any more crimes. But life in prison without parole, they're not going to commit any more crimes either. So there is not an additional incapacitation effect from the death penalty. Rehabilitation, second one. That means we need to kind of teach them and help them grow and become a responsible citizen so they won't want to commit crime anymore. Obviously, the death penalty doesn't do that. Restitution, paying society back, giving either money or labor or some kind of help to pay back either the victims directly or society in general. Death penalty doesn't do that. A dead person can't give back to the victims or society. Specific deterrence. Now, there's specific deterrence and general deterrence, and both of them kind of rely on let's teach people that crime will be punished and then they won't commit crime anymore. Specific deterrence is about that person. So the person you're punishing, if we punish them for committing this crime, they won't commit that crime anymore. That obviously doesn't apply to the death penalty because they're dead. They can't be deterred from committing crime in the future. They're dead. But the second part, general deterrence, that means we're going to punish this person so that everybody else who kind of witnesses that punishment will think, oh, I better not do what he did or else I'll get punished like that. So it deters other people, the regular citizenry, from committing the same crimes that the person you're punishing committed. This has been one of the kind of hallmark arguments for the death penalty. If we kill murderers, we will have less murder. It's great in theory, but in practice, the research shows that there is no general deterrent effect whatsoever from the death penalty. Research study after research study after research study has shown that states that have the death penalty don't have less murder than states without the death penalty. States that implement the death penalty don't see a drop in murder afterwards. States that get rid of the death penalty don't see a rise in murder afterwards. So there is no measurable general deterrence effect. Because, once again, as we talked about in the last subsection, people aren't rational. You know, if I come home and catch my wife in bed with another man, I'm not going to think about, well, should I shoot him or I might get the death penalty. No. In that kind of situation, you're emotional and upset, and you're not going to stop and think and rationalize, well, should I kill him or should I not? You know, if I'm a drug dealer and somebody tries to rob me and I pull out my gun and shoot them, you know, you're not thinking about the possible punishment of those actions. You're just thinking about, you know, the crime you're trying to commit. So the last one is retribution. And retribution is just, you know, there needs to be a moral balancing of the scales. We need to punish you because you're a bad person and you deserve it. And that really is the only one that the death penalty can really apply to. So none of the other 5 can really apply to the death penalty, either by logic or through research. The brutalization effect. So some research, although by no means all, some research has found that executions actually do the opposite of a general deterrence effect. So for every execution, murders actually tick up a little bit. And essentially the theory there is that people devalue life. Every time there's an execution, in people's minds, life is slightly devalued, so they're more likely to commit a murder after that, because they think, oh, well, if, you know, people are dying all over the place, who cares whether I kill one more, right? But that's a very controversial thing in the research. You know, some research shows that it exists, some research doesn't. There's debates about it among, you know, the criminal justice academia. But it is a theory, an interesting idea that I thought I'd put in here. Now, here's another problem with the death penalty, is that research has shown that it's pretty well definitively racist and classist, okay? So the race of the murderer and the race of the victim have both shown to affect likelihood to either go, you know, be charged with capital murder versus regular murder, so even have the death penalty on the table, and whether you actually do get the death penalty or not, okay? And interestingly, the race of the victim is actually more controlling. There's more, you know, the research has shown that that's more important, if you will, than the race of the defendant, the race of the person who's accused of committing the murder. So it's not necessarily who you are or what color of skin you have if you're going to kill somebody. It's what color of skin the victim had. I mean, it's both, but the victim is, if anything, more important than the skin color of the defendant, right? So if, you know, if we look at statistics across the United States, roughly half of all murder victims are white. It's roughly 50-50 white and other. But if we only look at capital murder cases, right, cases where people are charged with capital murder, it jumps from 50% of victims to 80% of victims who are white. So you are much, much, much more likely to face the death penalty if your victim is white than if they're any other color. In Georgia specifically, okay, if we look at all the different murders, white on white, black on black, black on white, and white on black, okay, 15% of all capital cases were white people killing black people. 15%. 70% were black people killing white people. That is a huge, huge difference in the numbers. Okay? Related with race, and statistically fairly, difficult if not impossible to separate from race, is the idea of class, i.e. rich and poor. Race and class in the United States are really inextricably linked. But the if you're poor in the United States, you get appointed counsel rather than counsel meaning a lawyer. You can hire your own, but they're expensive. So only rich people can hire their own. But it's okay because if you're poor, you will get an appointed counsel. And they have found that people with private counsel are way, 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 way less likely to get the death penalty than people with appointed counsel. Because appointed counsel is usually overworked, usually has never tried a capital case before, really probably doesn't know a lot about capital cases. And related to both of these, there's the instance of juries, right? Before a trial starts, each lawyer, the prosecution lawyer and the defense lawyer, gets to, they have this big pool of jurors. And the prosecution and the defense each gets to strike a certain number of jurors, i.e. get rid of them, they're not on the case, they're not on the case, they're not on the case, they're not on the case. They get a certain number each that they can strike for any reason at all, no reason, doesn't matter, they don't have to give a reason. In so many cases, African American defendants are convicted of murder and given the death penalty by all white juries because the prosecution counsel has struck every African American or person of color on the jury or the potential jury until the only options left were white jurors. Okay? Now, last thing we're going to talk about is medical professionals and the death penalty. There are lots and lots of different places where doctors and nurses and other medical professionals kind of could theoretically or do in practice come into play and enter into the equation of how and when the death penalty is used. Some of these medical associations have said, yeah, that's fine, you can go ahead and do that. Others, they say, no, don't. That is wrong. That violates medical ethics. That should absolutely not be allowed. No medical professional who has taken the Hippocratic Oath should do that. The first is testifying at trial. And this is one of the ones where they've said, medical providers, you're absolutely allowed to do that. So testifying at trial, it might be about, the nature of how the victim was killed. A psychiatrist might talk about whether the defendant is sane or insane, things like that. But then, assuming somebody has has received the death penalty, here's where it gets a little more ethically questionable. Okay? The first is determining fitness for execution. So as weird as it sounds, if you are ill, either physically or mentally, they won't execute you until you're better. But to determine whether you're okay physically and mentally to face the death penalty, to be executed, they need a medical professional. So is it ethically okay for doctors and nurses and such to determine your fitness for execution? Are you physically and mentally well enough to be executed? And here's the really important question. If they determine that no, you're not physically or mentally well enough, do they have a medical responsibility to then treat you and make you well enough to face execution. That's a very ethically questionable thing. Then on the day of execution, there's the preparation for the execution, i.e. sedating the person, tying them down, helping with the preparation for the drug. So if it's lethal injection, starting the IV in their vein, that kind of preparation for the execution is medically questionable. Then there's the actual facilitating execution, i.e. pushing the button, injecting the drugs, loading, pushing the drugs from kind of the vials where they exist through the IV tube and into the patient. Is that medically okay? The vast majority of medical people say no, that's absolutely not okay, medically, ethically. Determining death, i.e. this person has been injected with these drugs, the heart monitor is flatlining, the instruments say he's dead, but it takes a medical doctor to pronounce death in the United States. So is that okay? Is it okay to have a doctor present at the execution just for, citing time of death and determining, okay, he's dead officially? And then finally, this is not such a big deal in the United States, but it's a very big deal in places like China. What are the medical ethics about benefiting from the executed? i.e., in China, there's fairly overwhelming evidence that convicted criminals are executed and then their organs are harvested and given to doctors in hospitals to give to other people. And now normally it's fairly uncontroversial. Dead people giving up their organs, saving lives with it, absolutely. That is something we should encourage. If you're reading this and you haven't signed up as an organ donor, please do. That is a very important thing to do. Once I'm dead, I hope as many people as possible can get use of my organs. But when they're executed criminals, that brings a certain amount of ethically questionable flavor to that question, especially in a country like China, where they don't even have approaching the due process rights of the United States. China is, I don't want to say known for, but not completely unknown for them to be accused of executing people either for no reason at all, or for political reasons, or for really, really ethically questionable reasons. And do we want doctors to benefit from those questionable execution practices, even if it also helps their patients, right? There's still a medical ethics thing. But that's the end of our section on the death penalty. Thank you so much for watching.